An education system which only exists to make people uncritically obedient, now at the point where objectively demonstrable facts are disregarded, and the only factor which matters in grading is if you follow the teacher's instructions. The said system being proposed to promote critical thinking. The government bombing a majority of the world, even though they haven't officially declared war with any country since 1942. Despite this, the number of bombs being set off are increasing annually at a systematic rate and have been since the early 1980s. Despite the purported changes in ideologies and approaches to foreign policy, this allows all governments to wage war while simultaneously declaring that there are no wars. And the destruction of the mere ability to have philosophical discussions by creating labels such as right-wing or left-wing for people to put themselves in, which are vague to the point where they encompass self-contradictory ideas, but simultaneously attempt to apply to any and every idea, the intention being to rob the population of the ability to conceive of any other political reality other than being subjugated to the state, and simultaneously giving them the notion that they have control over the state as long as they utilize it to fight their neighbors who have different interests. Now, if this sounds like some sort of Orwellian hellscape to you, you'd be right, because everything which I just explained is literally George Orwell's description of how Ingsoc controlled the population in 1984. However, everything which I just explained is true about every government in the world today. Though, to be fair, the declarations of war bit is exclusive to the US, but every other country is similar in that they're fighting their own, if not the exact same undeclared wars the US is in, but that's aside from the point. All governments are Orwellian like this. I mean, the social contract and the idea that politicians represent you while you never actually gave any consent, and the politicians have complete dominion over every aspect of everyone's lives. But my point is that they seem to be getting worse, and not only this, but all failed states in history seem to have identical characteristics in the waning years of their reign as the modern states do as they're reaching their end. Former Soviet citizens, for example, in the last few years of the Soviet Union, describe a political landscape which, quote, made them feel as if reality was breaking down. The Roman Empire constantly waged wars with any other country they could, then claimed that every single one of them was an act of self-defense, and the British Empire kept trying to take control of the other countries of the world for their resources due to the dying state of their command mercantilist economy, just to name a few examples. So, I've done a bit of research into the peculiar phenomena that I've been observing, but I haven't made a full video explaining what I've found, despite the fact that I've mentioned it several times by name. So, today I'm going to be explaining what late-stage statism is and why it occurs. So, late statism is a thesis which proposes that all governments are fundamentally determined to fail as a result of structural flaws inherent to the government's functioning, and these problems, as well as any government's reaction to them and consequent attempt to do damage control after they surface, are identical and can be observed to repeat itself. I mean, this should be made self-evident when you see that thousands of governments have existed throughout history. Most of them don't even survive a century, and 99% of them have already collapsed and are now either defunct or reformed in some new form. But in case it hasn't, here's an explanation as to why all governments will inevitably fail. So, whether or not you believe in government, the function of a government by design is something which everyone can agree with. A small group of people come forward and declare that they are the only ones allowed to arbitrate within a said geographical area, and consequently have the ability to rule whatever they please is legitimate, even if it has no explanatory power. This is why people are forced to pay taxes, and it isn't considered theft, even though there are no discernible differences. Why police could just kill anyone they want for no reason and get a paid vacation, while if someone who's who's not a government employee so much as pokes a cop, they can be arrested for fourth-degree assault, and an extra charge assaulting a police officer. Well, regardless, this coercive system necessarily requires an enforcement mechanism, since without it, there would be nothing stopping competitors from entering the market, and since it doesn't actually produce any resources, this makes it dependent on private producers, like any other private DRO. The difference is that unlike a DRO, the state steals from people using its various services, which are enforced by the police and the military, which they also own and control. Unlike a DRO, which is dependent on its customers and engages with them voluntarily. The state must do this since it doesn't produce any services, yet requires the ability to provide services in order to sustain itself. But this is a problem for a variety of reasons. As new industries come into existence and the population expands with more people associating with more commodities, the government has to expand itself because these extra people and new industries require them to utilize more resources in order to maintain the services they provide. So sorry, minarchists, but the government always will inevitably expand its influence over the market and propose ridiculous tax rates out of necessity. Anyway, so here are the main two issues with this. Firstly, any service which operates around an exponential growth curve is inherently unsustainable, and basic economic concepts such as scarcity can explain why this is. On top of this, there's the problem we've already gone over of states not being able to produce any commodities or resources, nor do government services have supply or demand curves, so they can't innovate new resources into existence either. In fact, they can't even efficiently distribute commodities because of this. Secondly, this necessitates the existence of a monopoly on credit, which leads me into my next point. Because all government services operate on an exponential growth curve, the mere concept of a scarce private money, which has competitive and independent issuers of credit, are antithetical to the existence of a state. This, on top of the other established problems we've already gone over, make the state dependent on central banking, or determined to eventually resort to central banking. The state's inability to actually produce any commodities and reliance on forceful redistribution ensure that they cannot ever create money which has scarcity and is valuable in and of itself simply because it was once a preferred medium of exchange and has so many characteristics that give it an even higher level of marginal utility to where it's only valued as an intermediate point between exchanges. This means that the two modes of currency which could ever be issued by the state will either be reserve notes or fractional reserve banking. Reserve notes are notes issued by the state which the state claims can be exchanged at any time for a preferred medium of exchange, usually coming in the form of gold or silver. These are unsustainable because as the economy expands, the state will end up producing more currency than they have or could ever possibly have in reserve to back up its value. This is exactly what happened in 1971 when France realized that their government alone had more US dollars than the U.S. claimed it had in gold reserves. So most governments of the world en masse attempted to exchange their dollars for gold, which created a feedback loop that caused the U.S. to either have the dollar default or get off the gold reserve standard. And fractional reserve banking, which is what a reserve currency will always inevitably lead to, create currency out of thin air. More specifically, the Federal Reserve in the case of the U.S. requests that the Treasury Department, on behalf of investment banks, print new money. Then the Treasury Department will claim that it'll pay the Federal Reserve back with interest by increasing taxes. It should be relatively easy to see how this literal debt-based economy, which by design can only cause devaluation and poverty, is unsustainable. And the state's monopoly on credit is where the structural flaws start leading to politicians being compelled to act in what seem to be incredibly bizarre ways on the surface. surface, but if you start examining the effects of what they're doing as an aggregate, rather than listening to what they claim to ideologically support, then it starts to make more sense. So, too long didn't watch. Governments fundamentally by design have to increase spending, and as the market becomes larger, the state will need to spend more to manage more. This is the reason why states will perpetually expand their influence over society, and why states require a monopoly on credit. So okay, we now know why governments always will become more authoritarian and why they are doomed to collapse. Yes, and you may have noticed that currency created by the state cannot have value as it doesn't have scarcity, and since it's created out of thin air, its utility is virtually non-existent by itself. And it's about this point where it's important to explain that late statism and late stage statism are two different things. Late statism is the general idea that governments are structurally unsustainable, and late stage statism is a pattern of emergent behaviors and actions which can be observed by the government towards the end of late statism. And there are two parts to the cycle of late statism. There is when the state forms and when it becomes entirely dependent on fractional reserve banking. Now, the U.S. has an interesting history which is different from the failed states of the past in that the U.S. attempted to jump into late-stage statism before they were forced to out of economic necessity. This is evidenced by the fact that 3 decades after signing the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the Bretton Woods Agreement was formed to make the U.S. dollar a reserve note again in 1944. And yes, you will notice within that 30-year period where the U.S. jumped headfirst into late-stage statism, the U.S. involved itself into World War I and World War II, as well as the Great Depression occurring. This is not a coincidence, and we'll get back to that in a moment. Now, what causes late-stage statism is quite simple. The state has to try and maintain its exponential growth curve while not being able to produce anything and consequently being only able to utilize money that's value comes from debt. This is harmful for its market because as the state increases its taxes and creates more regulations, it becomes more difficult for producers to enter the market since it costs more capital to invest, and this consequently leads to less employment and more expensive commodities since there are fewer producers and the producers who are in the market aren't able to produce as much or hire as many people as they would without the state, leading to less economic activity and in turn less actual resources being produced by the private producers. Now, without central banking, this would make the state unsustainable alone because eventually politicians would have to establish a command economy as a consequence, which is a problem because without supply and demand curves, it's not possible to properly allocate resources. Fiat currency works the same way, however, currency or money differs from commodities in that the state can only make trade with commodities less profitable. But with fiat currency, the only way it can have any sort of tangible market value is through economic manipulation. This doesn't change anything or make it any more sustainable. The utility that consumers perceive is still completely made up and is just smoke and mirrors. But this is primarily where governments begin to enter late-stage statism. In order to attempt and sustain the fiat currency they're pushing, governments will form international treaties with other governments to force producers of the world to only trade with the currency they want them to. In the case of the United States, that agreement is OPEC, which is why the U.S.'s foreign policy for the last 40 years has been so heavily centered around oil, and aggression for the last 50. Coercion is temporarily able to keep the statist economy from collapsing during late-stage statism. This is a process which is known as cartelism. Two other consequences of this attempt by the state at market manipulation are the boom-bust cycle and wars, both of which occur as a result of the state seeking to manipulate interest rates by loaning hundreds of millions of dollars into investment banks and arms producers, and attempting to stimulate demand for their country's fiat currency. So, of course, historically, this hasn't led to the end of governments. Usually, when governments reach the end of late-stage statism and collapse, a new government or new governments form. The Roman Empire, for example, became the British and Byzantine empires, both of which dissolved into multiple different countries of their own, which are now mostly defunct and reformed into new governments. You get the idea. The inevitable fact that all governments will inevitably default does not lead to statelessness naturally, because the society is not an immediately competitive one without the state. It still has a monopoly on arbitration, or a power vacuum as some refer to it, and politicians from the former government generally end up taking ownership of the monopoly on arbitration and creating a new constitution to repeat the same process over and over again. However, with new commodities constantly being innovated into existence, which make our means of association more decentralized, and through the invention of cryptography-based trade, which is a money by definition that holds value due to its scarcity and the overwhelming abilities which can be utilized efficiently, when the states collapse this time, people will be able to store their assets into alternative means of association like cryptocurrencies. We've already seen that in some of the recent bad days for the stock market, the demand for crypto increased at the same rate that demand for gold did. Consumers view crypto as a preferred medium of exchange similar to gold or silver. And when the demand for crypto reaches a certain point, the market will stabilize, which will only cause it to become more valuable as the value of the dollar plummets and the regulated market becomes more expensive and impossible to trade in. So with this counter-economy, which exists now, but will dominate after the state collapses, it doesn't appear as if the state has a realistic future, because if the entire economy becomes centered around decentralized trade, which can't be tracked or monitored by design, it can't be regulated, and if trade can't be regulated, then it can't be taxed, which means that a state forming would be impossible, and that a competitive market would consequently form immediately as the state collapsed. So this was an explanation of late statism. If you liked it, please comment, rate, and subscribe. And yes, I already know that there exists a subreddit called late statism, but this is a separate thing entirely. Anyway, see you all next time. This evening, as a matter of fact, because I'm doing a Q&A live stream tonight.